Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If we could begin. Thank you for coming to this session on security threats to Europe, focusing for the most part on the military dimension. In a previous panel, we looked at some other aspects of the security threat, in particular strategic communications. But here we want in particular to look at the more straightforward military aspects. First of all, we want to look at the threat from the south. And when we think of that in military terms, obviously we're thinking particularly of the ISIS threat. But we have to ask ourselves, to what extent is this a military problem, and to what extent has it got to be dealt with by other means? And the second aspect, which I would just like to touch on really, is the future role of the UK in relation to the EU in defence matters. So just a brief word really about ISIS, first of all. There is a coalition operation against ISIS. It began in August 2014. There are some 66 nations who are part of that coalition, 27 of which make a military contribution in the counter-ISIS activities. This has been concentrated in Iraq, but to some extent in Syria as well. There have been some 14,000 airstrikes since this campaign began. The problem was realized, I think, in the middle of 2015, that this wasn't going to be resolved by airstrikes alone. There were insufficient local forces willing to engage ISIS militarily, and more had to be done about that. And we got into this very difficult area then of local, if you like, freedom fighter groups and other groups being engaged in this whole campaign, which then created some difficulties with allies such as Turkey, but we can talk about that. I've said that the military aspect in counter-ISIS is just one aspect. We talk about 5 lines of effort in the counter-ISIS campaign. One is the military side. The second is stopping the flow of terrorist fighters. A third is cutting off access to finance by ISIS. A fourth is addressing the associated humanitarian relief problems. And a fifth area is exposing the true nature of ISIS. I think that takes us back to the earlier conversations we were having about strategic communications. Various nations have taken the lead in each part of those counter-ISIS activities. I should mention that neither NATO nor the European Union are coalition members, although NATO, for example, will be contributing its AWACS surveillance aircraft against ISIS, and they will be increasing the training missions for personnel, mainly Iraqis. There are problems of different priorities among the different coalition partners. Different coalition partners have different levels of risk tolerance, what they're prepared actually to do, and different partners therefore have different rules of engagement, caveats on the use of their forces, and so on, all of which makes it highly complicated and difficult. But the fact is now the ISIS capability has been degraded, not defeated, but degraded, and ISIS territory has been pushed back, and more progress is being made in that area. I know that Nikolai in a moment will say a little bit about the another crisis area which is, if you like, an aspect of what's been happening with ISIS, namely the migrant flows across the Mediterranean. A separate problem, but related in some respects. And I think we need to just have a look at, well, what's actually going on militarily there. We have two operations. One is the EU's Operation Sophia. The sort of key bit of that began in October last year. Cynically, some might say this is just an exercise in fishing refugees out of the Aegean and the Mediterranean. Indeed, a recent report by the British House of Lords concluded that Operation Sophia does not in any meaningful way deter the flow of migrants, and there is little prospect of it overturning the business model of people smuggling. So we have to ask ourselves, what exactly is Operation Sophia supposed to be achieving? Meanwhile, NATO also has been involved in this process. And so there is now a NATO operation in the Aegean, which is essentially a surveillance and intelligence gathering operation in support of Operation Sophia. There's a question about, we might ask whether this is an appropriate role for NATO naval forces. So, ladies and gentlemen, these are just some of the aspects that we might touch on this afternoon. I think I mentioned this whole question of the UK. I was very interested that in spite of all the denials pre-referendum, that the United Kingdom was not supportive of an EU army. Nevertheless, even pre-referendum, we were still tacitly supporting EU military operations and therefore encouraging the EU in this direction, which to my mind is very difficult and dangerous. But David Davis speaking, who is our Minister for Brexit, the new Minister for Brexit, speaking in the House of Commons on Monday, said, we want to maintain or even strengthen our cooperation on security and defence with the EU. So we have to ask ourselves, where does all that leave us? So these are some of the questions that I put in the air. Now, we have two speakers with us this afternoon. First of all, Con Coughlin, who is a most distinguished journalist and author of nearly 40 years' experience, who once narrowly avoided being kidnapped by Hezbollah. I think shares the view that the EU army is a threat to our very security. He's currently the Daily Telegraph, which is one of the biggest selling newspapers in the United Kingdom, the Daily Telegraph's defence editor and chief foreign affairs columnist, writes regularly on topics as varied as Qatar to the Chilcot Report, Nigeria and the Royal Navy. A man of vast range in all of these things. He's written many books on the war in Iraq, on Ayatollah Khomeini, and most recently on Winston Churchill. Not a man to shy away from controversy. Con, perhaps you'd give us the benefit of your thoughts. Thank you.